The desperate escape. Ayesha sat by the window of her father's grand house, staring at the world outside. The sprawling garden, the elegant marble floors, and the luxurious curtains meant nothing to her anymore. To the outside world, she was a rich man's daughter, living a life of privilege, but inside, she felt like a prisoner. Her father, a wealthy businessman, controlled every aspect of her life. He decided what she wore, where she went, and whom she spoke to. Worst of all, he had already chosen a husband for her, a cruel and arrogant man twice her age. Ayesha had begged, pleaded, and even tried to reason with her father, but all in vain. The wedding was set, and her fate was sealed. One evening, as she sat in her room, her mind raced for a way out. Running away seemed impossible. Where would she go? Who would help her? That's when she thought of Hamza. Hamza was a struggling but hard-working mechanic who worked at a small garage near her house. She had met him a few times when she had secretly gone for walks outside the mansion's gates. Unlike the men from her world, Hamza was kind. He had a simple smile, a hard-working spirit, and dreams bigger than his circumstances. Desperation took over. She approached Hamza the next day, her heart pounding in her chest. "Will you marry me?" she asked bluntly, shocking him. Hamza laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But when he saw the fear in her eyes, he understood. He hesitated. He had nothing to offer her. No wealth, no status, no comfortable home. But Ayesha didn't care. She wanted freedom, even if it meant living in poverty. A secret wedding was arranged. Under the dim light of a small mosque, Ayesha left behind a life of riches for a life of uncertainty. But reality hit hard. Hamza's home was nothing like the mansion she had lived in. A tiny room with peeling walls, a broken fan, and barely any furniture. The first night, she sat on the hard mattress, staring at the bare ceiling. The smell of oil and grease from Hamza's hands filled the air as he sat beside her. He was kind, but kindness didn't change the fact that she had no servants, no luxuries, and no comfort. Days turned into weeks, and Ayesha struggled with her new life. She had never cooked before, never cleaned, never worried about money. Hunger was a foreign feeling, but now it visited her often. She watched Hamza work tirelessly, trying to make ends meet, while she struggled to accept this new reality. Had she made a mistake? Was this truly freedom, or had she simply traded one form of imprisonment for another? Little did she know her real journey was just beginning. Harsh realities. Ayesha had imagined freedom as something beautiful, a life where she could breathe, make her own choices, and finally be happy. But as she sat on the thin, worn-out mattress in Hamza's tiny one-room house, she realized that freedom came with a price. The house was nothing like the grand mansion she had left behind. The walls were cracked, the paint was peeling, and the small ceiling fan barely worked. A single dim bulb lit the room, casting long shadows in the corners. There was no soft bed, no luxurious bathroom, no servants to prepare meals. Instead, there was a tiny stove, a rusty old cupboard, and a small sink that leaked water. The first morning after her wedding, Ayesha woke up shivering. The cold air slipped through the broken window, chilling her to the bone. She reached out for a warm blanket, but there was none. Hamza was already awake, getting ready for work at the garage. He smiled at her, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. "Breakfast is in the kitchen," he said before leaving. Ayesha stepped into the tiny kitchen and found a loaf of dry bread and some tea leaves. No fresh fruit, no eggs, no rich coffee like she was used to. As she took small bites of the bread, she felt tears prick her eyes. This was her life now. Days passed, and the struggles of poverty hit her harder than she had expected. There was no hot water for baths, no driver to take her places, no beautiful dresses to wear. She had never washed dishes before, but now she scrubbed them with her own hands. She had never cooked a meal, but now she stood over a smoking pan, trying to make something edible from the little food they had. The worst part was the silence. In her father's house, people were always around. Maids, cooks, guests. Here she spent long hours alone, listening to the distant sounds of the street. Money was always tight. Hamza worked hard at the garage, fixing cars from morning till night, but his earnings barely covered their expenses. Some nights, he came home with aching hands and empty pockets. Ayesha would see the exhaustion in his eyes, but she didn't know how to comfort him. One evening, as she sat waiting for Hamza to return, she heard a knock on the door. It was her neighbor, an old woman named Sakina. She handed Ayesha a bowl of lentil soup and smiled kindly. "You'll get used to it, dear," Sakina said gently. "Life isn't easy, but it teaches you things money never can." Ayesha forced a smile, but inside she wondered. Had she truly escaped, or had she just walked into another kind of prison? She had left behind one struggle, only to find herself trapped in another. She thought she had chosen freedom, but was this really the life she wanted? Clash of worlds. Ayesha sat on the edge of the creaky bed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The tiny room she now called home felt suffocating. The cracked walls, the dim lighting, the constant smell of oil and grease from Hamza's clothes. It all reminded her of how far she had fallen from her past life. She missed her old world. The grand dining table covered in exotic dishes, the soft silk bed sheets, the maids who took care of everything. Here, there was no luxury, only survival. Hamza walked in, wiping the sweat from his forehead. His shirt was stained with grease, his hands rough from hours of work at the garage. He smiled at her, but she barely acknowledged him. "You haven't eaten?" he asked, noticing the untouched plate of lentils and dry bread on the small table. "I'm not hungry," she replied coldly. He sighed. "Ayesha, you have to eat. This is all we can afford right now." She looked at him, frustration bubbling inside her. "That's the problem, Hamza. I can't live like this. I didn't know it would be this hard." Hamza's smile faded. He pulled up a stool and sat across from her. "You knew I was poor when you married me, Ayesha. I never hid that from you." "I thought it would be different," she whispered, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "I thought love would be enough, but—" "But what?" His voice was calm but firm. "You thought you'd run away from your rich family and instantly have an easy life with me?" She looked away, ashamed, yet angry. "I thought we'd build a better life together, but nothing has changed, Hamza. I'm stuck, just in a different kind of misery." Hamza's jaw tightened. He had spent all day working, dreaming of coming home to her smile, her warmth. Instead, every evening turned into an argument. "Ayesha, I work hard every day for us. I may not have money, but I have dignity. If you regret marrying me, just say it." She met his gaze, guilt creeping in. She didn't regret choosing him, but she hated how hard life had become. She hated feeling helpless. Silence stretched between them until Hamza sighed and stood up. "I'll sleep outside tonight," he muttered, grabbing a thin sheet and stepping onto the small balcony. Ayesha sat alone in the dimly lit room, her heart heavy. She knew Hamza loved her, and deep down, she loved him too. But love didn't fill an empty stomach. Love didn't make a broken home beautiful. She had thought marriage would be an escape, but instead, it had thrown her into a battle between her past and her present, and she wasn't sure which world she truly belonged to. The husband's dream. The sun had barely risen when Ayesha woke to the sound of Hamza moving around the small room. He was getting ready for another long day at the garage, washing his hands and face with cold water from the small sink. She watched him in silence, noticing the exhaustion in his eyes, but also something else, determination. She sat up, stretching. "You barely slept," she murmured. Hamza turned to her with a tired but hopeful smile. "Sleep can wait. I have work to do." Ayesha sighed. "Hamza, you work from morning till night, but we're still struggling. What's the point?" He sat beside her, rubbing his rough hands together. "Because I'm not going to be a mechanic forever, Ayesha. One day, I'll own my own garage, maybe even a car dealership." His eyes shone with ambition. "I just need time." Ayesha stared at him, unsure whether to believe in his dreams or remind him of their reality. "But how?" "We barely have enough money for food. How will you save enough to start a business?" "I've been learning," Hamza said. watching how my boss runs the place, asking questions. I'm good at what I do, Ayesha. If I work hard enough, one day people will come to me, not just for repairs, but for quality cars. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to share his optimism. But all she saw was their tiny, broken-down home and the empty pockets he returned with every night. One evening, Hamza came home with grease on his face, his hands blistered from hours of labor. But instead of complaining, he grinned as he placed a small envelope on the table. "First savings," he said proudly. Ayesha opened it and found a few worn-out bills inside. Not much, but something. This is for the business? "Every extra rupee I earn goes into this," he said. "It might take time, but I won't be a poor man forever, Ayesha. I promise." She looked at him, feeling something stir inside her. Hope. For the first time, she saw beyond the hardships. Maybe Hamza's dream wasn't impossible. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't stuck in this life forever. That night, as Hamza fell asleep beside her, she held the envelope close to her heart. His dream wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. And maybe, despite everything, she could learn to believe in it too. An unexpected challenge. For the first time since their marriage, Ayesha felt a glimmer of hope. Hamza's hard work was starting to pay off. His boss had given him more responsibilities at the garage, and his savings were slowly growing. He even talked about renting a slightly bigger place. Nothing luxurious, but a home where she wouldn't feel trapped. Ayesha had also changed. She no longer sat idly, waiting for life to improve. She had learned how to manage their small household, and though she still missed the comforts of her past, she had begun to believe in Hamza's dream. But life had a cruel way of testing them. One evening, Hamza came home later than usual, his face pale, his hands shaking. He sat down heavily on the rickety wooden chair, burying his face in his hands. Ayesha rushed to him. "What happened?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with devastation. "The garage, it burned down." Her heart dropped. "What?" "There was a short circuit in the wiring," he explained, his voice hollow. "The fire spread fast. Everything is gone." Ayesha stared at him in shock. "But what about your job, your savings?" He swallowed hard. "My boss says he can't afford to rebuild right now. He had debts. He's shutting the business down." Aisha's knees felt weak as she sank onto the bed. Everything they had worked for, gone in an instant. The money Hamza had saved was barely enough for rent and food. Without a job, how would they survive? For the next few days, Hamza searched desperately for work. He visited every garage in the city, every mechanic's shop, every workshop. But no one was hiring. The bills piled up. The little savings they had quickly disappeared. Ayesha watched helplessly as Hamza grew quieter, more distant. His once bright eyes now carried a shadow of worry. One night, as they sat in silence, Ayesha finally spoke. Maybe we should ask my father for help." Hamza's jaw clenched. "No." "Why not? He has the money. And he will remind you of what you left behind. He will make you regret choosing me." Ayesha knew he was right. Her father had disowned her the day she ran away. Going back now would mean admitting she had failed. But hadn't she? As Hamza lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, she felt fear creep into her heart. She had once wondered if she had made the right choice by marrying a poor man. Now, for the first time, she wasn't sure she could survive the consequences of that choice. Would their love be enough to survive this storm? Or was this the breaking point? A test of love. The silence between them had grown unbearable. Hamza spent his days outside, desperately searching for work, while Ayesha sat alone in their tiny, dimly lit home, lost in thought. The fire at the garage had taken everything from them, their savings, their stability, and Hamza's hope. The money was gone. Their landlord had already given them a warning. If they didn't pay rent soon, they would be thrown out onto the streets. Ayesha had never known such fear before. Growing up, she had always been protected. Her father's wealth had shielded her from every hardship. But here, with Hamza, there was no safety net. One afternoon, as she sat staring at the cracked walls, there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find an unexpected visitor, her father's driver. "Your father wants to see you," he said. Her heart pounded. She had not spoken to her father since the day she ran away. She hesitated, but curiosity and desperation led her to follow the driver back to the grand mansion she once called home. Her father sat in his luxurious study, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I hear your husband is jobless, that you're struggling." Ayesha swallowed hard, refusing to let him see her pain. "I didn't come for charity," she said. He smirked. "No, but you should have. You left everything for that man. And look where it got you." She clenched her fists. "I didn't come to beg, Baba. Why did you call me here?" He exhaled sharply. "Come back home, Ayesha. Leave that miserable life behind. I'll forgive your mistake, and you'll never have to worry about poverty again." Ayesha felt a lump in her throat. The offer was tempting, so tempting. She could return to comfort, wealth, and security. No more hunger, no more fear. But it would mean leaving Hamza, leaving the man who, despite everything, had loved her when she had nothing to offer but herself. That night, she sat in their small, dark room, watching Hamza sleep. He looked so exhausted, his face lined with worry even in sleep. He had given her everything he could, and despite all their hardships, he had never once asked her to leave. A tear slipped down her cheek. She had a choice: walk away from this struggle and return to her old life, or stay and fight for the life they had dreamed of together. In the quiet of the night, she made her decision. The next morning, as Hamza got ready to leave for another desperate job search, she took his hand. "I went to see my father yesterday," she admitted. Hamza stiffened. "And he asked me to come back home," she said, searching his face. "To leave you." His grip on her hand loosened, pain flashing in his eyes. "And what did you say?" She smiled through her tears. "I told him no." For the first time in weeks, Hamza's eyes filled with something other than despair. Love, relief, hope. "We'll get through this, Hamza," she whispered. "Together." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The transformation. Ayesha woke up before dawn, something she had never done before. The air in their small home was cold, the faint sounds of the city waking up outside. Hamza was still asleep, his face peaceful despite the weight of their struggles. She watched him for a moment, realizing just how much he had sacrificed for them. Something inside her had shifted since she made the decision to stay. She was done feeling helpless. If they were going to survive, she had to fight, not just wait for things to change. She stepped into the tiny kitchen and prepared a simple breakfast, tea and leftover bread. It wasn't much, but it was the first time she had taken charge instead of expecting Hamza to carry all the weight. When Hamza woke up, he looked surprised. "You're up early." She handed him a cup of tea. "I want to help, Hamza. I don't want to sit here waiting for things to get better. We'll fix this together." He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, slowly, he smiled. "We will." Taking the first step. Ayesha spent the next few days thinking about how she could contribute. She had no work experience. Her life had been one of luxury before, but she was smart, and she had learned quickly how to survive in a world without wealth. One afternoon, she noticed an old sewing machine in their neighbor Sakina's house. "Do you still use this?" she asked. Sakina shook her head. "It's been collecting dust for years. Do you know how to sew?" "I can learn," Ayesha said confidently. Sakina let her borrow the machine, and Ayesha spent hours practicing. She mended Hamza's torn shirts, fixed their old curtains, and even created small decorative pieces. Slowly, she began taking small orders from neighbors, fixing clothes, stitching pillow covers, anything that could bring in a little extra money. Meanwhile, Hamza refused to give up. He found a temporary job assisting at a small workshop while still searching for a way to rebuild his career as a mechanic. Their income was still low, but for the first time in months, they weren't completely drowning. Finding purpose. With each passing day, Ayesha felt stronger. The girl who once cried over lost luxuries now felt proud when she earned her own money, even if it was just a few rupees. She no longer saw their small home as a prison. It was a place where they were rebuilding their lives together. One evening, Hamza returned home with good news. "I found a place that's hiring mechanics. It's not much, but it's a start." Ayesha smiled. "That's all we need. A start." She realized something important that night. True wealth wasn't about having servants or silk dresses. It was about having a purpose, a partner who never gave up, and the strength to stand back up after every fall. She had married a poor man to escape her past, but in the struggle, she had found herself. The months that followed were tough, but both Ayesha and Hamza had discovered something within themselves they hadn't known existed: resilience. They worked tirelessly, each doing their part to keep their dream alive. Ayesha's small sewing business grew steadily, and she had earned the respect of the neighborhood for her skill and dedication. Hamza's new job, though humble, was a stepping stone, and he never stopped looking for better opportunities. Every evening, after a long day of work, they sat together and shared their progress. Sometimes it was just a little more savings, sometimes it was a new opportunity, but it always felt like they were moving forward. The old hopelessness had slowly been replaced by determination. Then, one afternoon, Hamza received a call that would change everything. He had applied for a mechanic position at a well-known car dealership in the city. It was a long shot, but he had put his heart into the interview and presented his skills. To his surprise, they offered him the job, a managerial position with a competitive salary. The news hit Ayesha like a wave. She hadn't expected it. Hamza, always so humble about his abilities, had hidden his belief that he could make it. Now, the recognition was coming. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaky. This is huge." Hamza, with a broad smile, nodded. "I'm sure. I've worked for this, Ayesha. I've learned everything I could, even from the hardest times. This is my chance." The offer meant more than just financial security. It was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifices, and unwavering belief. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was about to manage a whole team of professionals, and with it came the possibility of eventually opening his own business. Building together. The first few months in his new role were challenging, but Hamza rose to the occasion. He worked long hours, navigating the complexities of the business, while still supporting Ayesha's growing sewing business. They both managed to balance their work and their relationship, always helping each other. Ayesha, too, felt a surge of pride. Her own business had expanded, and she had even started selling some of her creations in nearby markets. They weren't rich, but they were building something lasting. One day, Hamza came home early, a big grin on his face. "I've been promoted," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "I've been given more responsibility. Soon, I'll be managing not just the repairs, but the sales department too." Ayesha could hardly believe it. "Hamza, this is incredible." He kissed her forehead gently. "We did this, Ayesha. You've been with me every step of the way." A new beginning. As the months went by, their life began to transform. Hamza saved up enough to rent a small shop, the first step toward opening his own garage. They had both worked hard for this moment, and now the fruits of their labor were beginning to show. It wasn't just financial success that mattered. It was the journey they had been on together. The hardships, the challenges, and the moments when they both doubted themselves had all been stepping stones to something greater. One evening, as they stood in front of their new shop, Hamza turned to Ayesha, his eyes full of gratitude. "Look at what we've built. It's just the beginning, but it's ours." Ayesha, her heart full, smiled. "Yes, it's ours, and we did it together." Their rise from the depths of poverty to success wasn't just about material wealth. It was about a shared vision, unwavering love, and the belief that together they could overcome anything. Regret and revenge. It had been a few years since Hamza's business had taken off. The small mechanic shop had grown into a full-fledged garage, and his reputation as a skilled mechanic and businessman had spread throughout the city. They were no longer struggling to make ends meet. In fact, they had achieved a level of success that Ayesha never could have imagined when she first ran away from her old life. But just as things were looking brighter, the shadows of her past came knocking on the door. It started with a phone call. Her father's voice, cold and commanding as always. "Ayesha, I need to speak to you." Ayesha's heart sank. She hadn't heard from him in years, not since she had chosen Hamza over the comfortable life her family had provided. She had built a new life, one that didn't need the approval of her father, or anyone else from her past. She picked up the phone, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you want, Baba?" "Your mother is sick," he said. "She wants to see you. You'll come, won't you?" Ayesha didn't hesitate. No, but her father wasn't giving up. "Ayesha, think about it. You're successful now, aren't you? The man you married, he's done well for himself. It's time to stop living like this. You can have everything back, your old life, the comforts, the respect. Don't let it slip away just because of a foolish decision." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. They weren't just trying to pull her back, they were mocking her for the choices she had made. The life she had built with Hamza was everything she had ever wanted, yet here was her father, still trying to tear it down. Old faces, new desires. It didn't end there. A few weeks later, Ayesha received another surprise. A former friend from her high society days, Sarah, called her out of the blue. "Ayesha, darling, I heard about your husband's business. It's so impressive. I knew you'd end up doing something extraordinary," Sarah said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I was wondering, would you and Hamza like to come to the city's gala next week? There's going to be some high-profile people there. Such great networking opportunities." Ayesha's chest tightened. The girl who had once looked down on her for marrying beneath her was now calling, pretending as if they had never been apart. It was the same with the others, the people who had rejected her, who had scoffed at her decision to marry a poor man, now wanted to be part of her success. At first, Ayesha was confused. Part of her wanted to show them that she had made the right choice, but as she listened to Sarah, all she could hear were the echoes of the judgment and disdain from her past. They didn't care about her or Hamza, they only cared about what they could gain. She felt a spark of anger, confrontation, and choice. The next day, as she shared her frustrations with Hamza, he listened quietly, his face hardening. "I knew this would happen," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "They'll try to pull you back. They never respected me and they never will. Don't let them. We've worked too hard to let anyone, especially them, tear us down." Ayesha nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "I'm not going back to that life, Hamza. Not for anything or anyone." But the pull was strong. The invitation to the gala sat in front of her, a tempting reminder of the status and recognition she had once known. Her family, her old friends, they all wanted her back. But at what cost? One evening, she stood before the mirror in their modest living room, the reflection of her once pristine, glamorous life staring back at her. She had changed so much. She had learned to love a man who had nothing when she married him, but who had now built something real, a life of dignity. She couldn't let her past overshadow the strength they had found together. She picked up the phone and called Sarah. "I won't be coming to the gala," Ayesha said, her voice steady. "You're right about one thing, though. I've built something extraordinary. But it's not for show. It's for us. And we don't need your approval." There was a long silence on the other end before Sarah finally spoke, her voice faintly surprised. "I see. Well, I thought you'd changed, Ayesha, but it looks like you're still clinging to that man and his modest life." Ayesha took a deep breath, her decision clear. "I haven't changed, Sarah. I've just learned that real success isn't about impressing people who never cared. It's about building something with the one person who's always been by my side." She hung up the phone, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. It was over. The pull of her past, the temptations, the doubts, they no longer had a hold on her. She walked into the kitchen where Hamza was preparing dinner and kissed him gently on the cheek. "We did this together," she whispered, "and we'll keep building our future no matter what anyone thinks." Hamza smiled, his eyes filled with pride and love. "Yes, we will." They had come so far, and not happily ever after. Ayesha stood at the window of their new, modest home, looking out at the quiet street below. The world felt different now, calm, secure, yet not in the way she had once imagined. When she had first run away from her family, she had dreamed of a life of luxury and ease. She had envisioned wealth as being synonymous with fine clothes, lavish dinners, and endless comfort. But now, as she watched the sun set over their small neighborhood, she understood something profound. Wealth wasn't just about money. Her life had changed in ways she hadn't expected. The struggles they had endured had shaped her into a person who now valued what truly mattered: love, support, and partnership. In the beginning, it had been difficult. The challenges they faced seemed insurmountable. There were days when the weight of their hardships felt too heavy to bear. But through it all, Hamza had never wavered. He had worked tirelessly, always believing that things would get better, and when she had almost given up, he had been the one to pull her back. Together, they had created a life, one where money, while important, was not the measure of their success. Ayesha turned from the window as Hamza entered the room, holding a small, worn book in his hands. "I found this today," he said, holding it out to her. She took it from him, her heart swelling with emotion. It was the book they had both read during their early days together, when they had nothing but dreams and a small apartment to call home. The pages were frayed and well-worn, but it was a symbol of everything they had been through. "I can't believe we've made it this far," Ayesha said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "When we first started, I never imagined we'd have this life." Hamza smiled, his eyes filled with the same quiet pride she felt. "I always knew we could. It wasn't about the money, Ayesha. It was about the strength we had in each other, and that's more valuable than anything money could buy." Ayesha felt a warmth spread through her chest. She looked at Hamza, the man who had believed in her when no one else did, who had stood by her side through every challenge, and who had never stopped dreaming of a better life for both of them. She had built a future with him, not in the ways she had once expected, but in ways that were far more meaningful. "Do you remember," she said, taking his hand, "when I used to dream of all the things I could have? Beautiful clothes, fancy parties, wealth that would make everyone respect me?" Hamza chuckled softly. "I remember. You were convinced that was the only kind of happiness." "And now?" she asked, raising an eyebrow with a playful smile. "Now, I know you're happier than you've ever been," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "And so am I." The simple truth settled in. They didn't need the approval of anyone. Their love, their partnership, was enough. Every sacrifice, every hardship, had led them to this moment, a life built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and unshakable loyalty. Ayesha looked around their home, small, yes, but full of warmth, love, and memories. They had worked for this life together, and now it was theirs. "I love you," she whispered, leaning in to kiss him. "I love you too," Hamza replied, his voice steady and full of conviction. And in that moment, Ayesha knew that their journey, though far from easy, had led them to the greatest treasure of all. Happiness wasn't in the wealth of things, but in the wealth of love, partnership, and the unwavering support they had for one another. They had their happily ever after, not because of fortune, but because of the life they had created side by side.